Cheerilee settled into the prompt's corner for the third time that night. Her stomach rumbled, and her throat was dry. In hindsight, she should have probably put some popcorn and water there, but it was far too late for that. With a sigh, she turned her attention to the stage, and just let her mind wander to the rhythm of the story for a while. "No, my decision is final. You will have to go," the king screamed at Sir Altruis, who returned his indignant glances with worried looks. "But my king, the royal guard, they are needed to defend the capital. With tensions rising in the east, we have no ponies to spare. You know this, Altruis. I trust in your capabilities. You will not fail me, like the others have. For if you do, I'll have to accept this cretin's challenge myself." The king sighed, the weight of the situation suddenly pressing heavily upon his shoulders. Altruis, seeing his king's troubles etched into his face, fell silent and simply nodded. Without a further word, the knight turned around and walked away, leaving the confines of the royal court to head down to Reginald's part of the stage. The two fillies played their parts so well, it was easy to forget they were playing at all, even for Cheerilee. Applebloom had shown an almost single-minded dedication to the script, and knowing it was thoroughly as she did obviously allowed her to concentrate on other aspects of acting, the words came on their own. Sweetie Belle had been a bit less diligent, but she possessed a way with words and vocalization that made her a natural actor, although Cheerilee ventured to guess that singing was probably more her style. It was somewhat ironic that they'd both find their end doing something they were at least moderately competent at, while they were otherwise pretty much a waste of space. But Cheerilee was careful not to equate a single useful skill to being a worthwhile individual. The play had fallen into a familiar pattern by that point, Sir Altruis being the third attempt to finally put a stop to Reginald the Sly. Sweetie Belle, like the other three before her, started to make her way to the other side of the stage, although she clearly wasn't aiming to get to the mountain Scootaloo had disappeared into, or the house the other two fillies had found. Instead, she resolutely headed for a forest at the far end of the stage, that is to say, to the few cardboard trees that together gave the impression of a forest. She quickly reached her destination, and as the lights above the part of the stage were turned on, it became clear that some pony was already waiting for Sir Altruis there. The audience wasn't very surprised when it became clear it was Reginald's once again, but the bear trap around one of his back legs, which he couldn't seem to get out of, was certainly an unforeseen twist. The knight approached carefully, but Reginald inevitably picked up on his hoofsteps before too long and craned his neck to look around. "Well, well, seems at least one of us is lucky today. The great knight arriving during the villain's finest hour. You must be thrilled," he said bitterly, wincing slightly. Altruis said nothing for a moment. "Are you hurt?" he finally said. The villainous pony laughed and shook his head, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Oh no, this thing is very comfortable, in fact." "I'll get you out," the knight responded as she stepped forward. "But if you make one strange move—" He never got to finish his sentence, when suddenly something caught around his hind legs, and the world flipped upside down. Before the knight realized what was happening, he was hanging down from the ceiling by his hoofs. To the audience, however, it appeared as if he was hanging from one of the cardboard trees. "Hey, let me down!" Reginald cackled maniacally as he opened the clamp around his leg, revealing to be an impressive fake, but nothing more than that. He casually strolled over to the captured knight and mockingly gave him a little push, making Sweetie Belle swing around slightly. "Ah, dear Altruis, is it not? Not one for skulking about, are we? You'd have to be quite good not to be spotted by me. Anyway, And that legendary kindness. Who knew it'd get you in a position you are now? He laughed again, giving the knight another push to keep him swinging. If you know what's good for you, Reginald, you'll come with me. The king is fed up, and whatever his next move may be, you'll probably not like it if you stick around here. Altrius replied, holding on to as much dignity as he could while upside down and swinging around. I've heard the same tale spun twice before, good stallion. I'm quite sure of it by now, so if you don't mind, this'll be goodbye. Say hello to the beasts of the underworld for me. The sly sneered as he pulled one of the omnipresent hidden levers, one that had been concealed behind the tree. The floor opened, and the rope was released all at once, sending the filly screaming down a now open hatch in the floor as the lights faded and Reginald disappeared off-scene. Sweetie Belle saw Fleur approach rapidly, and panic coiled around her like a snake. Weren't there supposed to be a few mattresses With a thud, she hit the ground, and as she lay there motionlessly, she didn't have to think about anything for a while. When she came to, she was in a dimly lit room, lying on a table of some description. She felt a nasty bump on her head throb painfully to the rhythm of her heartbeat, but when she tried to touch it with one of her hooves, she realized her front legs were tied above her head with a rope, while her hind legs were bound on the other side. The ropes were keeping her stretched out as much as possible. It was more than a little uncomfortable. It also felt as if the table had a large hole in it, right underneath the middle of her back, but she couldn't for the life of her figure out why. Her first thought was that she had probably hit her head harder than she thought, and that this was all hallucination or some sort of dream. But if it was a mighty convincing one at that. She tried looking around the room, but as there was only one single weak lamp right above her, she couldn't see much. Suddenly, she imagined seeing something move in the shadows, a shape that broke the monotony of immobile shadows with a deeper kind of darkness. Is some pony there?" the filly said shakily. Applebloom and Scootaloo had told her more than a few scary stories during their camping trips, and an unnerving amount of them started off just like this. She sighed in relief as Cheerilee stepped into the little circle of light. "Oh, Teach! I hit my head and I don't know where we are, so could you please?" she begged, nodding her head towards the ropes. Her white skin grew even paler than usual when she realized Cheerilee was carrying a hammer in her mouth. She didn't know why that freaked her out all of a sudden, but there was something in Miss Cheerilee's eyes. Miss?" she squeaked. Cheerilee's only response was to lift up one of her hooves, revealing her to be wearing another one of those special work pony shoes, not unlike the one she'd used to hold the chisel. This one had a far smaller hole through, and the circle wasn't completely closed off. It was designed to hold nails, while still being able to slip the shoe off the nail through the opening once the job was almost done. "What are you?" Sweetie Belle began, but she cut herself off with a scream as Cheerilee let her actions speak for her, hammering a nail diagonally into the filly's right hoof and through her heel until it got stuck in the wooden table below her. She felt a trickle of warm blood coat the nail and bit her lip as she struggled to keep calm, for she knew simply attempting to pull her hoof away now would cause even more damage, and more importantly, pain. Not that the ropes currently offered her much freedom or movement, but she didn't want to take any risks. With tears in her eyes, she tried pleading with Cheerilee again, completely bewildered by this recent chain of events. Her mind racing to figure out what was going on, how she could wake up from this nightmare. "Please stop. What have I..." filly whimpered. Cheerilee just smiled sweetly as best she could with a hammer between her teeth as she prepared another nail, this time putting it in place against the filly's other hind hoof. The mare looked Sweetie Belle in the eyes intently for a moment, making sure she knew exactly what was coming for her. Sweetie Belle whimpered and swallowed back a new burst of tears before crying out, "No! Help, sis! Rarity! Any pony!" But no pony replied, let alone came to her rescue, as Cheerilee hammered down for the second time, driving the nail through the filly's left hoof and into the table with just a few well-aimed blows. Sweetie Belle squeaked in pain as she tried her best to keep still. The necessity of remaining still weighed down upon her as heavily as the pain itself. She kinda understood the concept behind walking it off a lot better now, as she'd have given anything to be able to do just that. She sobbed as Cheerilee ducked down to retrieve another nail, walking around to the other side of the table. "No, please, no." The white-coated filly sobbed, letting out a desperate cry as Cheerilee started nailing one of her front legs down, before quickly doing the same with the other one as well. Sweetie Belle could feel pain radiating through each one of her legs, but for her tormentor it still wasn't enough. Unaffected by the filly's crying and pleading, she continued on and dove a second nail through each of the filly's legs, this time straight through the ankle just above the hooves themselves. Little pools of blood started to form around her hooves, flowing off the edge of the table and dripping down to the ground lazily. In the heat of the moment, Cheerilee dropped the hammer and tentatively held her tongue underneath one of the little streams, savoring the taste of Sweetie Belle's warm blood as it dripped into her mouth. It tasted even better than Scootaloo's had, perhaps because it hadn't had as much time to cool down yet. The filly was still crying softly as Cheerilee rummaged about, retrieving one of several matches she had stored in the room. She struck it against the nearby wall and bowed her head down to light a fire underneath a metal cylinder that reached up from just above the floor to the table itself. A connect to the table in the spot where Sweetie Belle had felt a hole in the wood earlier. The little bits of wood and tinder the mare had prepared for this occasion caught on fire quickly and continued burning nicely. Smoke circled up to hang just underneath the ceiling. Cheerilee looked up at it, but wasn't too worried. The room was badly ventilated, but it was a small fire, and she wouldn't need that much longer in any case. A minute or two passed, Cheerilee just mesmerized by the small flame as she waited, thinking of the fun she'd had with snails earlier. The white filly slowly stopped crying, sniffling pathetically as she looked at Cheerilee through teary eyes, confused by the mare's actions, but hopeful that this pause meant she was reconsidering keeping her there against her will. "Please, miss, if you let me go, I won't tell any pony, I promise," she managed to say with a trembling lip, but again Cheerilee neglected to respond. Suddenly, Sweetie Belle became aware of a panicked, squeaking noise coming from somewhere in the room. The sound increased in intensity steadily, until it sounded like a great many rats were fearing for their lives somewhere. Even though that didn't seem to make any sense, she had some trouble locating the source of the noise, until she realized it came from right underneath the table, from the thing Cheerilee was staring at, but which she could not see. As her teacher stepped closer to the table, she mentally recoiled, but the mare simply leaned in and reached underneath the table itself, grabbing hold of a metal plate at the top of the cylinder with her teeth and pulling it out, removing the last barrier between the cylinder and the hole underneath Sweetie Belle in doing so. The squeaking quickly escalated to unprecedented levels, but still Sweetie Belle couldn't make head nor tail of it. What did rats have to do with a metal plate? Suddenly, the filly gasped, and her eyes grew wide with fear as she felt dozens of little claws scratching at her back, as the entrapped rats surged from the overheated cylinder to find a way to escape the flames. Even in their frenzied state, they recognized the difference in hardness between their metal prison and the filly's tender flesh, and they were fully prepared to put some effort into creating a way out of it, meant living to squeak another day. Many mouths and claws worked together as they started to gnaw and tear at the filly's back, her terrified screams of pain not managing to extract any mercy from the swarm of vermin. She tried arching up her back to lift it out of their reach, which would also set them free, but with her body stretched to its limit, held firmly in place by the rope and nails, she couldn't even lift it 1/10 of an inch. The rats quickly ripped away patches of her coat and skin, relentlessly going on to gnaw at her flesh. The filly screamed as she thrashed her head about from side to side, unable to do anything else as the rats started to devour her alive, piece by piece. Like a well-oiled digging implement, they ripped and tugged at her muscles and ligaments, tearing out sinews and arteries before both. As they pushed onwards, several of them came face to face with her spine, but decided to simply gnaw around it when it proved to be a nut too hard to crack. After all, they were aiming to break free, and didn't have a bone to pick with any of the elements that made up Scootaloo's body in particular. The filly herself shrieked like a banshee, foam appearing in her mouth as her muscles convulsed, and her body thrashed around as much as it could, which is to say not much at all. Regardless of that, she still moved enough for the nails to pull at the wood and the wounds they had inflicted on her, causing the holes to become larger and bleed even more profusely. But this, although painful, was only the least of her troubles, as the rats' combined efforts finally broke through layers of skin and muscle, and they erupted into her abdominal cavity, clawing up past her intestines, or in some cases, simply gnawing through. The unpleasant and torturous feeling soon turned Sweetie green with nausea as her blood stomach buckled and she vomited, partially managing to spray an extra on the table, but some of it getting onto herself as she could only barely lift her head to aim it away. The ensuing screams were music to Cheerilee's ears, and when copious amounts of blood started to stream out of the bottom of the cylinder, falling down into the fire with a hiss, her legs got all wobbly with excitement. As the rats continued to bite and claw their way through Sweetie Belle, her screaming slowly shifted to a wet, gurgling noise. With each passing second, more of her internal organs got ripped to shreds, as the disoriented rats tried to find a way out. Few of them stayed right on the target as they started advancing on the upper part of the filly's abdomen, opposite to the point where they had entered. Some of the other rats were clueless, though, as they kept going around in circles or started off in completely wrong ways, digging horizontal tunnels of gore through Sweetie Belle. As one of the rats tore through her diaphragm, the filly's breathing became shallow and troubled, and Cheerilee started taking up bets on herself as to what would kill the filly first: loss of blood or the inevitable destruction of some vital organs, or the other. It wasn't long after that the filly's stomach started to bulge out, before suddenly a blood-soaked rat tore away the last patch of skin with his sharp claws and poked his head out of her stomach. To Cheerilee, the small furry critter was the most adorable thing she'd seen in quite some time, especially the way it looked around the room with curious eyes. It clawed its way fully out of Sweetie Belle's warm entrails and made its way down to her quivering body and off the table, soon followed by a dozen of his brethren as they all fled their meaty container and scurried off into the darkness. The pale filly's body convulsed, so wildly with shock that not even the ropes were able to hold her down anymore. She thrashed and shook against her bindings as a stream of blood flowed out of her mouth and down her chin, nails ripping through her flesh or simply getting pulled out of the table altogether. After a few violent seconds, during which most of the rats escaped, all of the nails had ripped through either her flesh or her hoof, or both, but the filly was already too far gone to notice or care. Her body convulsed one last time as she let out a horrifying choking sound, and then the filly, finally, passed away. In the ensuing silence, the only thing that could be heard was the dripping of blood and Cheerilee's heavy panting, since the blood flowing out of the cylinder had long since extinguished the crackling flames the mare had lit earlier. A few moments passed during which Cheerilee tried to control the trembling of her body, until suddenly a soft squeaking noise could be heard. The reason for Sweetie Belle's choking sounds towards the end became apparent as her mouth opened and one of the rats, forcing his way out of her throat and climbing past her teeth to freedom. Cheerilee burst at once into hysterical laughter, still in the throes of hilarity when she took the stairs back up to get the fillies and colts dressing area. All the way up there, only one question was on her mind. Why had no comedian ever thought of this before? Death was simply hysterical.